Welcome back. We are SISociety, a global community that fearlessly explores taboo topics around our sensuality, intimacy, and sexuality. And this is Taboo Talks, weekly conversation where we dive in with leading minds in order to bring shadow to light. Today, we continue to excavate this foundational topic of boundaries and consent as it relates to intimate relating and beyond with our seasoned guest, Ricky Goodall. And Ricky is an introspective author and facilitator dedicated to exploring the depths of personal transformation and conscious connection. His book, The Way of the Garden, A Hero's Journey from the Human to the Higher Self, delves into the metaphor of the garden as a reflection of the journey towards self-discovery and spiritual growth. Through his work with conscious intimacy games, Ricky creates spaces where individuals can connect authentically, fostering a community grounded in respect, empathy, and mutual support. His passion for personal growth and meaningful relationships continues to inspire others on their own path to the higher self. And we are so honored to welcome Ricky into this space to have this juicy exploration. Thanks for being here with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So let's just dive right in and get all up in that boundary conversation. My question for you is, what do you think is like the biggest boundary that is oftentimes crossed when it comes to our interpersonal and intimate relating?
I would say, the biggest issue with boundaries is that people don't set their own boundaries and they don't respect their own boundaries. In my experience, whenever my boundaries were being crossed, it's because I wasn't actually respecting my own boundaries. So I think the biggest boundary that gets crossed is our own personal boundary for ourselves. For example, let's say I tell someone not to contact me for a week, but then I message them the next day. I'm now teaching that person not to respect my boundaries because I'm not respecting my own boundaries. So I would say the person, that's a vague answer, but the personal boundary, my own personal boundaries are probably the boundary that people struggle with most.
Yeah, I love that answer. And it's definitely relatable. Like we have to set the stage. We have to be the example of how we desire to be treated and to treat others first and foremost before anyone else can adhere to those boundaries. Yeah. Heather, did you want to say something?
Yeah, you felt it, baby. Yeah, I think Ricky, we briefly talked about this, and I've worked with Ricky, and I'm just so grateful, first and foremost, to speak into the fact of having you here, because you're just such a clear channel, like really clear and really intentional. And I'm assuming that was born from maybe like some people-pleasing tendencies early on. At least that's been my experience. And to kind of riff on Alfina's question, how, if we aren't taught boundaries, do we get clear on boundaries? Like how does that process to begin if someone's watching this and they were like, I don't even know what a boundary is. Like, how do I start from the foundational point?
Yeah, good question. I started learning about boundaries in my recovery work around codependency. I didn't even know that I had codependency issues. And then as I learned about codependency, I realized, oh, everyone has codependency issues. There are just people that know they have them, and there are people that don't know they have them. And so I read the book Facing Codependence by Pia Mellody, and how she teaches about there are essentially two types of boundaries. There's internal and external boundaries. She says our external boundary is kind of like a bell, like a big glass bell that kind of goes over top of us. And we sort of have this, like, this is our physical boundary. And then she explains our internal boundaries, sort of like doors that open inside. So one is like our emotional boundaries, where we get to decide what we allow in. And then we have our external boundaries, where we get to decide what we allow into our physical space. So mine was really born out of suffering. I didn't even know that I had an issue with boundaries because I didn't know I had an issue with codependency. And as I learned more about codependency, I realized that a lot of what I thought was healthy relationship dynamic was really actually unhealthy, toxic relationship dynamics that I learned through my parents and my teachers and society and the media. And as I started going on my journey of seeking more understanding, I started looking for relationships that were healthy that I could model after, and I couldn't find any. Literally couldn't find any anywhere. There are people that appeared like they're in healthy relationships. And then as I got closer, I saw the codependencies, and I saw the ways that they don't respect their own boundaries, or they just don't set boundaries. And so I think it's a it's such an intense issue because it's so new in human psychology. This idea of codependency and boundaries. And these are ideas that have been around for a little while, but when you think about humanity as a whole, I mean, we're talking like the last 100 years, we started to recognize these things versus the thousands of years that humans have been in relationships. So it's such a new concept that it's difficult to really even answer the questions around it, except for from a personal subjective experience.
Mm. Thank you. Thank you for that answer. Yeah, I'm grateful that boundaries are coming to the surface in the collective, and I, like many of us, are navigating the challenges of those spaces. And one thing that's been coming up for me is how different my boundaries are depending on who I'm with, depending on what I've been through, depending on what I'm healing through. And yeah, I would love to open the space if you feel called to just speak a little bit more about that process for you and what that has looked like.
Yeah, I mean, like the boundary conversation goes all the way back into early childhood for me. I was sexually abused when I was 3 years old by a distant family member who was a man, and I didn't have the opportunity as a child to set my boundaries. I was too young. So as I'm learning about how that impacted me sexually and psychologically, I'm learning that what that basically taught me was that one, my boundaries don't matter, and two, I don't have any boundaries anyway. So that became the foundation in my relationships, is that I didn't really know what boundaries were, and I didn't really know that I could even have them, let alone know how to set them. So for me, and I didn't respect boundaries either in so many of my relationships, because again, I didn't know what they were. My parents were struggled with drug addiction and crime and poverty and all sorts of things when I was growing up. So I didn't have models for what healthy boundaries look like. I just had walls or no boundaries. And there's a difference between a wall and a boundary, I've learned. It's like a wall is like nothing's getting in, nothing's getting out. Whereas a boundary is almost like a fence where I can still see over the boundary. I'm just deciding what I'm allowing in my yard. Whereas like a wall, I can't see anything out in or out. It's just kind of like a prison, basically. So rather than having boundaries, I would either have no boundaries or I would have walls. So I would allow somebody to do whatever they wanted to me, or I would just have walls and cut them out of my life completely, which I thought was a solution. But as I went on with life, I realized that the people that I was bringing into my life were a psychological match for me. So if I put up walls with one person in my life, but I don't deal with the psychological damage that's causing me to bring that person into my life in the first place, then I'm just going to bring another person into my life like that anyway. So I had to start to recognize that the boundaries were really an outward expression of something more internal that was going on, about healing and taking responsibility for myself and healing the deep wounds that led me to believe that I wasn't worthy of having boundaries, or I wasn't worthy of saying no or saying yes to certain things that I desired in my life. So it's such a complex topic, the idea of boundaries, because we went throughout history where we didn't have any boundaries. And then there's sort of like this revolution in boundaries where, some people just want to like throw boundaries out there. I need to have boundaries with all these people, but meanwhile, not having boundaries with themselves. So saying I'm going to get up at 7 a.m., but I get up at 9. Well, you're disrespecting your boundaries. Saying I'm not going to eat junk food, but then I do it anyway, disrespecting our boundaries. So it's like, if what the spiritual teachers tell us is true, that our external world is a reflection of our internal world, then the reason people don't respect my boundaries out there is because I don't respect my boundaries behind closed doors when nobody's looking. So I don't make my bed when I get up in the morning, or I don't put my clothes in the laundry hamper, or whatever boundaries I have for myself that I'm not respecting. And it's not to say that we have to do those things in order to respect ourselves, but if I have a boundary with myself that I'm not respecting, then I'm teaching myself that I don't respect my own boundaries. So then other people aren't going to respect my boundaries either. So it becomes a sort of having boundaries in relationships is really a personal experience, a personal journey that I have to develop inside and with myself first.
Yeah, it's an inside job.
I love that perspective. And just to piggyback off what you're saying, I feel like growing up too in my family, the boundaries could be created, like from your experience, I should say, the boundaries were maybe created out of a place of protection because you were hurt. And so we put up that wall to protect ourselves. And the boundaries can end up coming off as like a way to be defensive, or also in my family, it was a way to be controlling. So either like I'm trying to control you with these boundaries, or I'm trying to protect myself from your control or from whatever it is with the boundaries. When I feel like that's not really the point of boundaries. It's not about protection or control. In a way, it's more just about being authentically expressed and being able to just like be neutral. It's not like I'm trying to take or I'm trying to protect. It's more of just like, this is who I am. Like, take it or leave it. It's just, I feel like we're finding this balance where the boundaries aren't distorted. Like they're not coming through as like a distorted way to protect or control, but just as a way to empower our truth. And we're like coming back to the meaning, like the true meaning of what boundaries are really about and a healthy way to express them. And I wanted to ask you, because you're talking about how we've pretty much all been in codependent relationships, whether we know it or not. And I want to ask you, Ricky, like now, how do you see us being in healthy boundaried relationships? Like, what does that look like? Give us an example of what you think an ideal non-codependent, like more interdependent, healthy boundaried relationship would look like.
Mm. I had somebody, I saw a Facebook status like 2 months ago. A guy said, you can't have boundaries and be unconditionally loving at the same time, because that's conditions. You're setting conditions on somebody, and that's not unconditional love. And I was really grateful to see that status, because it helped me and a lot of people responded to it and agreed. Probably like 30 or 40 people responded to the status. And I ended up recording a video about it because I was so inspired by it. Conditions are me saying you have to be a certain way in order for me to love you. Whereas a boundary is saying this is the way my nervous system is available to be loved. So a condition is about you and a boundary is about me. So I think of boundaries like a sandbox. Like when kids are in a sandbox, that wooden boundary it's not a prison, it's not a cage, it's not a punishment. It's a way to keep the sand inside the sandbox so that the kids can play in there safely. So if I say, whether the boundary is take your shoes off when you come inside of my house, or the boundary is, hey, we're not going to have sex tonight, that boundary is not a punishment. It's actually an opportunity to experience a deeper level of pleasure, a deeper level of presence inside of that boundary. So if there was no boundaries in a sandbox, we wouldn't have a sandbox. We'd just have a bunch of sand in the yard. And it wouldn't be playful. There'd be no depth to the sandbox. Whereas when we have that boundary, we can still step over the boundary when the time is right. We can play inside the boundary, we can play outside of the boundary, but the boundary is there for our pleasure. It's there for our enjoyment. It's not there as a punishment. So again, it's like with codependency and relationships, I think we're learning that it's not that there's anyone that's not codependent, it's that everyone's on a spectrum of codependency. Because unless we are lived in a society of enlightened beings, then we're living in a society of codependency. Because from my understanding of the way, and this might, not everyone will resonate with this, but with the psychologists I work with and my mentors that I work with, I've learned that the cure for codependency is relationship with my own higher power. Whether that means a higher set of values, or that means a spiritual higher power, or that means some kind of higher moral values. So until I feel fully at home inside of myself, until I have a full secure attachment with myself, then I can't possibly have that with anyone else. And we've learned that the only way that somebody can have that secure attachment with themselves is to be totally resolved inside of themselves, which means that they have to be resolved in their spiritual or their consciousness or their psychological relationship with whatever their higher power is. So for example, if I have a belief that I'm not worthy because I'm gay and my religious beliefs are that gay people are not worthy of love, then I really have to resolve that before I'm going to be able to break my codependencies. If I think that because of my past behavior, I'm not going to be accepted by Allah or God or Christ or the Buddha or the morals of a society, whatever I'm carrying inside of me that makes me feel like I'm not enough, that's the source of my codependency. And so I'm always going to seek happiness. I'm going to seek validation. I'm going to seek approval outside of myself until I resolve that inside of myself. So the only way that we're going to reach a version of society that's fully interdependent is if we, and at least in my understanding, is if we really resolve the parts of us that make us feel not worthy to be in that society in the first place. So boundaries become a natural way of helping people understand how I'm available to be loved. So again, it's not a punishment. It's not like, oh, you're not allowed, don't call me for a week because I'm angry at you. It's more like, hey, I need to take space for a week because my nervous system can't handle being in a relationship with you right now. So it becomes less about what I need the other person to do or not do so that I can be happy or safe or whatever. And it's more about saying, this is where my nervous system is. This is what I can allow or what I'm available for at this time. And in order for me to be in relationship with you, I need you to meet these boundaries. And if you can't, then the boundaries become more like walls.
Yeah, so being able to be so in touch and in tune with your own needs, and then being able to communicate that with your partner or your family or friends, whoever you're relating with. Um, to go off that even deeper, like there's so much talk now about, alternative style relationships that are more sovereign and less codependent, like living in different houses or having different rooms or all these different, opening up your relationship in different ways. And I'm curious, like, what do you feel like? I would just love to go into some of these ideas because I think that they're so interesting. Like when we sleep in a bed with someone every single night and we're sharing these toroidal fields together and we're really enmeshing our energies even more. Like, do you see the future of more of these sovereign relationships, like moving to where people are in different rooms, are in different houses, like are more sovereign in their time, like more examples, I guess, of what more boundaries and relationships actually look like in our day to day?
Yeah, I asked my psychologist once. She's super highly trained. She worked with Pia Melody, the codependency expert directly, and Peter Levine, somatic repatterning. She's trained under these people. And I asked her, like, is it possible for polyamorous relationships to be healthy? And she said, well, it's just as possible as any other type of relationship because it's clear agreements, clear boundaries, clear expectations, and meeting each other's needs. And so in a codependent relationship, in my experience of all my codependent relationships, it was I have an expectation, usually unspoken, for the other person to meet all my needs that are related to intimacy, which is pretty much impossible for one person to meet all my intimacy needs. And so the relationships I had where I was sleeping in the same bed, they didn't work out. The relationship, I've only had one relationship where I've slept in a separate bed. It worked out for a while, but then it also didn't work out. So, I mean, it didn't work out in the sense that I'm not still in that relationship. For me, it worked out. I'm happy with how the relationship was. I'm glad that it ended, but I'm also glad that I had it. So I think that the sovereignty thing, and that's what when someone says, what's your relationship status, I would say sovereign. That's my relationship status. And so what that means is I'm whole and complete, and I'm going to bring somebody else into my life to add to that. I'm not going to come together and become, two halves coming together become one. I want two wholes to come together and become more than the sum of their parts. So this idea of like sleeping in the same bed, living in the same house, etc., it's like that made sense for thousands of years because we needed that to survive. Think about it from the most basic perspective. Human beings cuddle together so we stay warm. It made sense. I think that when it comes to raising children, at least for the developmental years, the earliest developmental years, having the child in the bed with the mother and potentially with the father too could be really helpful for the baby to develop. But I don't know if that's even true, if they need to be with the father and the mother, if they need to be with one or the other, because we just don't have enough information to know for sure. But we know that the baby needs to be cared for in the early stages of the life, especially in the first 3 to 6 months, for the baby to feel really safe. Whether or not the parents need to live together or relationships need to live together, it's like, I imagine that relationships almost have like so much energy to give, and if we spend all of our time together at the beginning of a relationship or for the first few years of a relationship, it's almost like we're spending all of that time in a really short period of time. And I know that people grow and sometimes we grow apart or we grow together. So I think it's hard to answer that question for myself because I don't have a lot of personal experience with it. But I know that I've always felt as if when I lived with somebody and slept in the same bed, I felt like I was doing it because I had to, not because I wanted to. Because I like getting up when I want to get up. I like spreading out and having my space. I've had successful nights of sleep in a king size bed when I can't touch the other person. Where I'm like, it's like I'm all good to cuddle until it's time to go to bed. Then I need my space. That's just me personally. So it's like everyone's different. So I think that the idea of having our own room, that's something that appeals to me. Having our own home, it depends. Like I like the idea of living in community with multiple people in the same home. And I also like living alone too. So if a person has the means to meet those needs of living alone and living in a community when they want to, then I think that's optimal probably based on how we're designed. Not everyone has that luxury of being able to make those choices. But I think that as we evolve as a human species, that sovereignty and that interdependence is leading us out of enmeshment, out of the codependency, into having our own space, our own experience, so we can maintain our individuality and really maintain who we are and our personalities. And again, it's not, maybe that depends on human design, or that depends on astrological signs, that depends on how we were raised. And I think every person's different, but I think we definitely need to have this opportunity, or at least this inclusiveness of those perspectives not being wrong, or, like polyamory, for example, or bisexuality or whatever. It's like, these ideas are not new. King David had multiple wives, Abraham had multiple wives, King Solomon had multiple wives. This is biblical. Polyamory is biblical. So these aren't new ideas. And even homosexuality. I watched a documentary the other day called 1946, the movie. And it talks about how in 1946 was the first time that the word homosexual was added to the Bible. Before that, it was never even in the Bible. And these researchers looked deep into what the words actually meant, and they meant something completely different. So if you think about monogamy and sexuality, is pretty much based on religious conditioning, at least in our society, and most of it was wrong. And now it's proven to be wrong. So our entire outlook on what relationships are supposed to be like is completely conditioning and propaganda. It's dogmatic propaganda and conditioning. It's not based on human psychology and happiness and joyfulness and fulfillment. It's based on what spirituality and religion has told us it should be like. And we're starting, and obviously we're growing out of that and expanding beyond that. So I think it's like, it makes, like, we think of bonobo monkeys, who are our closest living relative. They're primates that share 99% of our DNA, and they're the most compassionate species on the planet. They have no fighting, no violence, no conflict, and every member of the species gets nurtured. I don't know if sometimes one of the monkeys goes off into the woods by himself for a little while. I imagine they might do that. I know I need to go off and hibernate every once in a while, go into isolation, and then they spend time in the community too. So it's like, if we were in a community that was peaceful, that was compassionate, that where we didn't need space so much because we're constantly triggered, maybe it would be different. Maybe we would live all in the same house or all in the same community. But I think the need for space, especially for men, I know I'm going on a tangent here, but I'm really passionate about this topic. Men regenerate their testosterone through cave time. So the women on the call, or people on the call who have a man in your life, and if you're not a man, you don't understand this. When the man needs to disappear for a period of time, it's actually good. He's regenerating his testosterone, regenerating his energy. And we literally need that. But how many men in relationships where they live with their wife and their kids get that opportunity? And then we see these men slowly over time dying inside, losing their masculinity, losing their drive, losing their edge. And then the woman becomes in her masculine, and she doesn't understand what's going on with them. And so it's like, the way that we've been conditioned to be in relationship is the source of it all. And it's the conditioning and the programming. I think that's the source of it. So I think the sovereignty is the only way to evolve at this point.
You like touched on so many golden nuggets of like all these topics, like the bonobos and the science of the testosterone and the estrogen and how men and women differ, all these topics that Heather and I have been talking about recently. So like, yes, preach, preach, preach. And yeah, it's so interesting because like as women, we tend to be nervous when the man goes quiet. We're like, oh no, why aren't they talking? Why are they like leaving the room or the conversation? But that's really what men need to come back into center and to sovereignty. Whereas women, we actually like, we rejuvenate ourselves through just talking about it. And then we come back into balance. So yeah, thanks for bringing that in. And it's just so interesting that our whole society is built off of this monogamous religious template of the nuclear family, which is really just based off religion. And like you said, not really off of the psychology of what we need as humans to actually be successful and happy. And it's clear that with the divorce rates 50% and upwards, that it's not working in this model that we've been in. And so yeah, I'm like super interested in these alternative ways of relating, and I'm actually in one of these more alternative ways of relating. And something that I just realized this weekend, I'm just like, I can't share a bed. Like it's too much. I can share a bed like maybe once a week. But other than that, like I need my own space. I need my own like place to rejuvenate. I need to just like be in my own terrestrial field at nighttime. And I realized that in my past relationship, we were living together for 3 years, cuddling every single night. And I look at the dynamics of how codependent that relationship was versus like how sovereign and independent in the relationship I'm in now, as we live in different homes. And even when I visit, I'll like sleep in my own room most of the nights because I'm just realizing how much it affects both of us. And so I think like there is something really big to be said about where we're spending a third of our lives in bed, and how we're choosing to spend that really does affect us in our waking hours. So that was just an example that I'm glad you went into that more. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, yeah. And I want to just touch on what you said about divorce rates. It's like, you know, divorce rates are what, 50% or whatever they are. And it's like, yeah, but who said that's a failure though? You know, what's wrong with getting divorced? I mean,
Mm,
Jesus said something in the Bible about it, which is where most of the conditioning comes from. Jesus said something along the lines of like when you get married, you're two flesh joined as one, etc. And that passage, and I've read it a number of times, it's been interpreted to mean something really big that maybe it means, maybe it doesn't, but we don't really know for sure. And in the ancient in the book of Moses, and I'm using these examples because it's something I'm passionate about. We could use any religion though. Moses talked about divorce. Jesus said no divorce. So there's conflict in the Bible anyway. You know, the Old and the New Testament are in conflict about the idea of divorce, and Judaism and Christianity are in conflict about it. But like, if we think about relationships, it's like if I think about a relationship as a vehicle from one version of me to another version of me, then what relationships are ever a failure? You know, it's like if I have a client for 6 months and then that client doesn't want to work with me anymore, and then I go around telling everyone that it was a failure and we broke up and now we're not together anymore and I don't talk to that person. Like, it's crazy to think about that. Or you go to high school with somebody for a year and then the next year you're not in their class again. You're like, I don't talk to that person anymore. We broke up. We were in class together last year. Now we're not. It's like relationships don't end. They transform. And the ending happens because one person or two people are bitter and unable to resolve their differences in a conscious way. So their only option is to experience the grief and the loss. But I don't think that's actually necessary. You know, I've had plenty of relationships end, but really, well, they're just transforming. They go
mhm.
from being a deeply intimate romantic relationship to a friendship or to an acquaintance or to an ex-partner. But the relationship doesn't actually end. The container changes and transforms, but nothing ends. And so again, we have this idea of loss and grief as the motivation to stay in a relationship, to avoid the loss and the grief. Meanwhile, we're losing well, at least I have lost a part of myself during the relationship. And so it's like if a relationship served a purpose for a period of time, let's say children, or let's say whatever, you know, just a good experience, why is that a loss when the relationship changes? Or when two people decide to be with someone else, or when two people break up for a while, then they get back together. Like, what's wrong with that? I imagine that happens in nature constantly. I imagine it happens with the bonobo monkeys constantly. You know, so why is it so strange for us? And again, it's because it's religious conditioning. And from my understanding, at least, is that we are taught that it's wrong to get divorced. We're taught that it's wrong to separate. Well, where did marriage come from in the first place? And marriage was actually an agreement where I own you as a woman now. And that was how it started. It started over possession and ownership. So if we think about the roots of marriage in the first place, it's like it was never based on interdependence. It was literally a legal contract for codependency. And now we're getting to the point where it's so strange that people don't want to stay together. It's like, why is that strange? That makes perfect sense, actually.
Yeah, wow. So beautiful that you're touching on this. And what was coming through when you were sharing was just the relationship with my parents, right? And how from a young age, I knew that they weren't right for each other. In fact, I was encouraging my mom to leave my dad, but my mom was like, no, like we took an oath in front of God and I will honor that oath. And like my dad was like, you know, cheating on my mom, like the relationship was just deeply unhealthy. And there really wasn't much of a relationship to begin with. But what was holding them together was this religious contract, this concept of a religious boundary, you know, and I was there as this like young being, just completely confused before I kind of maybe had this collective conditioning really like set in that I'm now currently rewiring and unweaving. But it was really fascinating to witness, to just be like, you're unhappy, you don't like each other, I don't get why you're together. And so, yeah, I deeply resonate with just how you're interweaving the religious conditioning and how much that's affected us and how much we're like unfucking ourselves from that place. Like we're just like, we were in this knot, and now through boundaries, I see boundaries as this bridge to begin to connect us with the truth of ourselves, to come back home to ourselves. And we're unraveling that knot as we speak, which is exciting. I'm happy to be here, but woo, it's been a journey.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
Um,
it's like, it's really easy to look at the state of the world or look at the state of relationships, or look at the state of the media and be like, oh my God, what the hell's happening to us? It's like, this is what evolution looks like.
Mm-hmm.
It's evolution.
It's
However we want to look at it,
evolution.
it's evolution. It's evolution. Nature takes care of itself. So it's like, this is what evolution looks like. And it's a miracle that we're here. It's a miracle that we can have a conversation over a Zoom call about relationships, and that we're not living in the nature, naked, running around trying to find food. Like, it's a miracle that we can even have this conversation. So it's a gift that we're realizing this and coming to these realizations. But I think you're right about the oaths, and if that serves people to really commit to that oath, and that gives them a sense of purpose and gives them a sense of feeling accomplished or feeling like they're worthy of something, then whatever, it's their choice. But we just can't force other people to believe that just because some people believe it.
And
Of course.
commitment is something that it's an energy that you show up and choose every day. It's so much more than just a piece of paper that you sign as a legal document. Like, it comes from a devotional heart, and that can be forged in anyone's heart, regardless of what's on paper. And I'm also curious to hear you explain a little bit of the difference between codependency and interdependency.
Yeah, again, it's like I'm still learning, but I think that interdependency is essentially, I'm having a journey with my higher power, you're having a journey with your higher power, and I'm going to respect your journey and you respect my journey. And that's pretty much it. It's like, I'm not going to tell you what you should do. I'm not going to try to fix you, rescue, or save you. I'm not going to project my beliefs onto you. I'm not going to try to force you to change who you are and change your journey and be somewhere that I want you to be, or be someone that I want you to be. I'm going to respect you. You're going to respect me, and we're going to grow simultaneously. And we're going to have agreements, and we're going to have maybe boundaries with each other. Like, a perfect example between interdependence and codependence is unspoken expectations. So I expect you to know what I need before I even know what I need, and I expect you to meet that need before I know what I'm needing. That's codependency. Interdependency is, when I have a need, I'll express it, and you get to decide if you need it or not. And I'm going to accept your decision. And if you can't meet my need, I'll find somewhere else to get my need met, or I'll meet it myself. So it's like, codependency is, I'm expecting other people to change or to meet my needs because I want them to, or because I'm pressuring them to, or I have these expectations for them. Whereas codependency is that we're in this experience together, and where I'm in a relationship with somebody who wants my needs to be met, even if they can't necessarily meet them for me, or in that moment they can't meet them for me. It's like, codependency is really this addiction to validation and approval. I think in the shortest way to express it, because I'm wanting somebody else to do something for me, or be something for me, or have something for me, or validate me, or approve me, or please me, so that I can feel like I'm enough. Whereas interdependence is, I generate that validation and that approval internally, and I respect another person's ability to generate their own validation and approval internally too. So the simplest definition of codependency that I've heard is, it's an addiction to validation and approval. It's essentially this addiction, this need for approval, this need for validation. In fact, my sponsor says that codependency is the source of all addictions. Whether it's addiction to social media, addiction to food, addiction to substances, addiction to alcohol, addiction to sex, addiction to gambling, the core root of that is, I'm not enough on my own. So I need something outside of me to be enough. That's essentially codependency. So interdependence is, I'm self-governing, I'm self-sufficient, I'm secure inside of myself, and I add things to my wholeness rather than needing other things to make me whole.
Yeah, I love that. Like, and that we can be in codependent relationships with so many things outside of humans, like with food, with drugs, alcohol, like all these other ways that codependency shows up in these sneaky ways. I would love to also touch on the opposite side, where it's like, so we don't want to be codependent, but also we're a species that we also like need, like, it's shown that, living in community and it extends our longevity, and like, we are meant to connect, we are meant to co-create, we are meant to be in relationship too. So we don't want to go too far where we're like too hyper independent, because that's also been a trend. Well, I don't need anyone. I don't want to like I don't even want to be giving you anything because I'm just my own sovereign being. So, like, how do we also, forge relationships that we realize that we do it's like it's healthy to also depend and rely on people for certain things, but how do we like, yeah, what's like the balance on the other end where we're not becoming too hyper independent either?
Yeah, I'm having this image in my mind right now of like codependency is if we're having a conversation, I keep interrupting you and I don't let you finish so that I can validate myself by interrupting you and saying something. You know, that's an example of codependency. Independence is I don't even have a conversation with you. I just go talk to myself in the bathroom. Interdependence is where you speak and I listen, I speak, you listen. So it's this kind of dance that happens where I'm getting my needs met through our connection, but I'm not taking energy from you to get my needs met. You know, I'm coming from a place of giving. I'm not over giving, which is also codependency, but I'm not overtaking either, which is codependency. It's this healthy balance of give and take. Whereas interdependence or independence, there's no give and take because there's no one to give and take with. Codependency, there's no give and take. It's mostly taking because one person is either overgiving or overtaking and it's not balanced. But interdependence is this dance where we're both feeling like our needs are being met. We're both feeling like we're getting what we need from the relationship, but we're not relying on the relationship to meet all of our needs, especially the ones that only we can meet for ourselves. I used to be an avid interrupter in my communication. You know, as soon as I thought that I had a solution, I would interrupt the person and tell them. Because like, why should I listen to the rest of what they have to say? I already have the answer in the solution. But that was me trying to constantly rescue, fix, and save so that I could feel valuable. Because I didn't actually feel valuable in my relationships unless I was providing something. And as a man, this is rampant as with men in society too. We're our value, we've been taught that our value is based on what we can give, how we can rescue, how we can fix, how we can save things. So I was constantly trying to seek that value by giving and taking and rescuing and fixing and giving advice without permission and all of this. But as I learned to become more interdependent, it becomes more of a conscious experience where if I want to give advice, I'll ask permission first, maybe, or I just won't even give it at all. I'll just trust the other person to find their own journey. So again, codependency is sort of like this. It's an energy of taking. Interdependence is like or independence is not really taking. It's actually just a real neglect for any type of energy or needs to be met. And then interdependence is sort of like this giving and taking balance that happens. It's where I'm giving to the relationship, and I'm also allowing myself to receive in the relationship too. So I'm not so deeply neglected that I don't have anything. And I'm also not taking so much that the other person feels drained by me either.
The delicate balance of relationships. Thank you for speaking into that. And speaking of balance, we've touched a lot on masculine and feminine. And something that's been coming through to me that I want to open up the conversation for, Ricky, is the difference between how men and women express and share boundaries. And you've done a good amount of work around boundaries, and you hold space for both men and women in your community. And I'm just curious if you've noticed there's nuances and differences to how those two energies express in the masculine energy and in the feminine body.
Yeah, I mean, I can't
And
really speak.
sorry, just to
Go
like,
ahead.
just clarify for listeners too, like in terms masculine and feminine in terms of our hormones and like and our biology and the way that our brains work, because I just want to make it really inclusive. So it's not like a gender thing, it's more of a biological difference in understanding.
Yeah, and I might even call it an energetic difference. You know, there are plenty of masculine men or men who are very feminine and women who are very masculine, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just we have to understand how the dynamics work together. A dating coach I respect really well says there has to be polarity for the sex to be great in a relationship. So it can be a man and a man, but one of them has to play the masculine role, and one of them has to play the feminine role when it comes to intimacy and romance. We're also going to be depolarized, and there's going to be conflict. So to answer your question, Heather, it's like one of the dating coaches the same guy, he says men don't listen, women don't lie. You know, it's like how many times have you either, you don't have to answer this, felt like a man's not listening to you, you know, and how many times has a man maybe told you that you're lying about something? Well, it's like women have been evolutionarily programmed to not be fully honest with men as a way of surviving because we're the larger member of the species, where it's dangerous for you to always tell the exact truth about how you feel. And you're just not designed that way. You're emotional beings. The feminine is more emotional. So how she feels in this moment might not be how she feels in the next moment. So the challenge with that I mean, that alone explains the biggest challenge in boundaries in relationships between the masculine and the feminine, because the feminine may say, don't contact me anymore. And then a week later, contact the person. And that's normal. Whereas if a man says, don't contact me anymore, and then the man contacts or the masculine contacts, that's a breach of integrity. That's the masculine not living in integrity with his word. So it becomes very tricky. It's very challenging because the feminine only feels safe when the masculine is in integrity with his word. It's very important for the feminine to feel safe in the presence of the masculine. The masculine has to be in integrity with his word. If the masculine expects the feminine to also be in integrity with her word, considering her emotional waves and constant changes, then he may be very confused and not understand. So the easiest way, I think, for masculine and feminine to really navigate this is through conscious communication. It's continual conscious communication. Okay, you said that you don't want me to come over, but then now you're calling me. Do you want me to come over or do you not want me to come over? I want you to come over. Okay, I'm going to come over. Are you sure you want me to come over? This is like the masculine talking to the feminine. No, let's be very clear with what you're asking right now. I fucking hate you. Okay, you're saying that you hate me. Okay, I get it. 5 minutes later, I don't hate you. I love you. Totally normal if a feminine saying that to the masculine. The masculine saying that to the feminine, there's going to be a breach of trust there. It's going to be difficult for the feminine to feel safe in the presence of the masculine if the masculine's constantly changing how he feels or what he thinks, because that's more of a feminine trait. So when it comes to boundaries, it's like, it's better in my opinion, it's better for the masculine to stick to the boundaries that he sets. And I'm not saying I always do this, but it's better if we set the boundary and we stick to it. So if I say, I need a month apart and I don't want to talk to you for a month, I need to stick to that boundary for myself and for my relationship with the feminine. Because if we get really esoteric about this, there's two fundamental energies in nature. There's masculine and feminine, with darkness and light. Taoism teaches this, Kabbalah teaches this, Buddhism teaches this. There's masculine and feminine energy in nature. And so everything is basically the feminine and consciousness is the masculine. It's a simple way that I understand it. So the way that a masculine, a man, behaves towards women needs to be the same way he behaves toward nature in order for him to really fully be in his masculine. So his boundaries with nature have to be very similar to his boundaries with the feminine in order for him to be in his strength. So again, if a man says he's going to stop drinking and he keeps drinking, that's more of a feminine thing to do because that's changing his mind. And women change their mind. I mean, how many times you say you're going to wear something and you change your mind 10 times before you actually go out? Totally normal. Men typically make a decision and stick to it, or the masculine does. So in terms of boundaries, it can be really confusing if people don't understand these dynamics, because the feminine boundary, this is where it's really tough, especially when it comes to intimacy and sex. It's like the woman might say, I'm not having sex with you tonight, and then she might change her mind. And then it can be very confusing for the masculine because he wants to respect her boundaries, but now she's changing her mind. And then the man, maybe he wants that, so then he violates the boundary that they set. And then now she doesn't trust him anymore because she told him she doesn't want to have sex. Then she told him she does, and then he did it, and then now she doesn't trust him because she said she didn't want to. This is the problem that happens between men and women so often. So what I've learned is, like, when we set a boundary, we stick to the boundary. We say we're not having sex tonight, there's no sex tonight. Or else that person may associate the shame of violating their own boundaries with that other person, and now the relationship is tainted or damaged. So the best way the masculine can serve the feminine is to set realistic boundaries that he intends to keep and to keep them. And for the feminine, it's to be really conscious about her communication and what's really alive inside of her. Because again, like, you might say, I don't feel that way anymore, I've changed my mind. But then when the masculine has sex with you after you said you don't want to, then you're back to not wanting to have sex again, except now it's already happened. So it can be really challenging in this way. So the best thing women, or the feminine, I think, can do is to have compassion for the men when they get confused about the boundaries changing. And the best thing that the masculine can do is, like, keep it in his pants. And I mean that literally or figuratively, whatever the boundary might be. Set the boundary and stick to it, at least as long as possible, unless there's some kind of clear agreement, clear discussion that changes the boundary. So again, it's like, if a couple says we're going to take space for a month, he agrees and she agrees, but then 2 weeks later, he breaks the boundary, that can damage the trust of the relationship. If 2 weeks later she breaks the boundary, it can still damage the trust, but it's actually less likely to damage the trust because it's more normal for the feminine to change her mind than it is for the masculine. So it's really touchy, and it's like, it's not a perfect concept, and I'm not perfect at it myself, but I think it can be really challenging because what a woman feels or what a feminine feels in this moment may not be how she feels moments later. And so especially when it comes to sex, and this is when it's really important, it's like, if we said no tonight, then it needs to be no tonight to keep the integrity of the relationship. again, think about that sandbox. It's like, if we say no sex tonight, and then we don't have sex, there's so much depth inside of that boundary. There's so much that the kiss feels more powerful. The touch feels more powerful. The hug feels more powerful. Everything feels deeper because we know we're not going there. Now, if a man or a person doesn't get that, they may still be seeking the accomplishment. They still may be seeking the desire to break the boundary. But for the masculine, the feminine who can really settle inside of that boundary, the feminine may tempt the masculine, which is her job, continually tempt the masculine, like, hey, are you going to break the rule? 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 She may even straight out tell him, I love when there are rules just so we can break them, because I really love when we break the rules. And if he falls for that, temptation, then chances are there's, I mean, there, in my experience, the integrity of that relationship is going to be damaged. You know, in the way of the superior man, David Data gives a perfect example when the man and the woman are having sex, and she says, come inside of me. And then he does. And then she's like, what the fuck? Why did you do that? He's like, well, you told me to. She's like, well, I didn't think you actually would. And this is the perfect example of how the masculine and feminine works. The masculine takes things literally. The feminine takes things figuratively. And so if the masculine takes that literally, like, hey, we're not going to have sex tonight, but now we are, then he's going to lose integrity and lose the trust of the feminine. Whereas it's the feminine's job to tempt the masculine, at least according to like tantric Kabbalistic Taoist philosophy. It's like nature is continually tempting us, and it's our job to decide what our integrity is. So that's an esoteric answer to your question, but I think it's a case by case basis, and it's really, people have to understand their own, whatever their own energy is, and be able to play into that really well. And I think the best way that the two could work together is women could, or feminine could have more compassion for the masculine when he gives into the temptation. And the masculine could have more compassion for the feminine when she changes her mind constantly. And if the two just understood just that alone, that men get confused by you because you lie constantly, because you're changing constantly, and there's nothing wrong with that. You know, and I don't mean lie as in like, I don't mean lie as in say something that's not true, but I mean lie as in say something and then it's not true anymore. You know, and that's totally normal. You know, you think about even when you're close to your period, it's like you're everything's going on. I have no idea what that feels like. So for me to take you literally today and tomorrow and the next day and the next day and expect you to be consistent when nothing inside of your biology is consistent, that's just, it's ignorance on my part to not understand that. And same with the feminine, to wonder, well, why is the masculine giving into my temptation? I didn't expect him to actually do it. It's like, well, because men are constantly chasing that temptation. So it's really the compassion, I think, is the big thing that the two have to have for one another.
Wow. Well, first and foremost, I want to thank you for the work you've done on this planet. Like, it is potent, and it really just awoke something in me. And the example you used is particularly resonant because I moved through something similar recently, where like I set a boundary, and then I actually like wanted him to cross the boundary, and I was like, I'm testing him. Like I was consciously aware of it. And then I said I wanted to do the thing, and then we ended up doing the thing. And then there was like, oh, like, okay, I got him to do the thing. You know, there was like this whole kind of process, this psychological process that I was moving through. And I can see how as a being born feminine, how that there is a biological difference. And if what's coming through right now for me is there's this responsibility in communicating to the people around me my right to change my mind, and how that's perfectly normal and okay, and that I do it often, because there's been so much shame built around that for me, of like, oh, like I am of integrity, I need to say something and I need to mean it and I need to show up. But I am like forever in flux. Like one second I want this, and the next second I want something completely on the other side. So it's just, it feels so validating for you to speak into that. And it feels really shame reducing and shame dissolving you to speak into that. And I just express my personal gratitude for like the ever evolving seasons that exist within me and within the feminine.
Yeah, this is coming up a lot in my relationship as well, like being able to respect and trust each other and our boundaries, where I'm noticing that like my partner will give a really strict, clear boundary and just like, this is my boundary. And like sometimes like I will want to push that because I'm like, well, what about this? And what about that? And And I'm learning like this is the way that I can respect him, by just respecting and not needing to try to change it, not needing to try to check in on it. But then what I'm understanding is like, oh, I'm just projecting how I set boundaries and how I change my mind onto him, but that's not supportive of him. So if I can just respect his like boundaries that he sets and allow him to hold that, because that's a way that actually he can prove that he's more trustworthy. And then in turn, allow him to be more maybe understanding of the fluidity of my boundaries changing, and know that that's not to not trust me less, it's actually to trust me more. It's more honest for me to change my mind. It's more honest for him to not change his mind. And I think that really is just like for how we can understand each other and support and respect each other's boundaries and trust each other when we're saying our boundaries. So thank you. That was such a beautiful way to kind of wrap this episode, because we are coming into the end of it. And I just want to ask you, Ricky, if there's anything else that's kind of coming through your channel around boundaries and intimacy that you would like to share with our listeners.
Yeah, I guess the last thing, like Heather, where you said, you know, a part of you wanted him to cross the boundary. It's like, but that's the thing. It's like, it's not a conscious thing. It's an unconscious thing. It's the unconscious feminine doing what the unconscious feminine does. So Elf, you said about, you know, wanting to respect his boundaries. It's like, yeah, within reason, like, you know, if the boundaries don't have sex with other people and you do it, that's probably going to damage the relationship. If the boundary is don't take a bite out of my cake, but then you take a bite out of the cake just to sort of tempt him unconsciously, and you don't even realize that you're doing it until the cake's in your mouth. It's like, you know, there are levels, and the feminine's going to test the boundaries of the masculine. It's inevitable. You might not even know that you're doing it, but you're going to do it. You're going to test him and see how he responds so that he can level up as a masculine. And his job to like compassionately and patiently respond and reset his boundaries and be clear about what he wants is how he lives into his masculine. And that's how the feminine supports the masculine in the greatest way. It's like everyone else believes this bullshit, but the feminine's not going to believe him. She's going to continually test him, even when everyone else looks up to him and puts him on a pedestal and thinks he's amazing. She's going to be the one saying, "Hey, why didn't you bring the toilet paper home when you said you would bring the toilet paper home?" You know, she's the one that's going to continually poke and test.
Something that's just coming up that I want to share in regards to the situation that I spoke into before was that when he did the thing that I initially created a boundary around, I felt like I lost respect from him. Right. And that's when I consciously realized and started to connect the dots of like, oh, this is the test. Like, this is the test and the dance of the feminine. Like, I'm creating something that I feel firm in, or I think I feel firm in. You cross the line. And when you cross the line, I'm like, hey, I don't like that. That didn't feel good, you know? And it was a really interesting process. And yeah, you brought so much to today's conversation. Really, so incredibly grateful for all of this. And yeah, thank you for coming on today.
It's like the safety in the masculine lies in the consistency and the stability and like that anchoring presence. And then like the safety in the feminine lies in the movement, in the fluidity, in the ever evolving, changing swirl. And if we can like understand that about one another and not project the way that we are onto the other as safety, then we can really harmonize and learn how to create these really safe relationships that just complement each other really well.
Exactly.
Well, Ricky, how can our listeners be connected with you for all of your amazing offerings, for your book, and maybe there's other courses or other exciting offerings that you have that you would also like to share? I want to give you a few minutes to do that.
Yeah, thank you. So the biggest thing I'm excited about right now is my team and I are hosting a 6-day conscious intimacy leadership retreat in Ottawa, California from August 27th to September 1st. And so this is 6 days of diving deep into this work, practicing games and exercises designed to give us new strategies to actually express these things in triggering situations. So our games are actually designed to put you in situations where you're feeling uncomfortable, feeling vulnerable, feeling pushed to your edge. And then you're learning to develop these strategies of how to ask for what you want or say no to what you don't want or resolve conflict or be a better listener. And then repeating that over and over and over again to the point where it becomes an unconscious habit. I've been a martial artist for 30 years. And the secret of martial arts is you can't train once and expect to know how to protect yourself. You have to train consistently and practice consistently in order to be able to develop the skills. So this retreat is 6 days of diving into that deep work with a whole team of facilitators. And the best way to learn about that is the URL consciousintimacygames.com/retreat. And so in saying that, next week on August 8th, we're also hosting and launching Conscious Intimacy Academy officially on August 8th for the Lion Gate portal. Yeah, Heather's familiar. And that will be consciousintimacygames.com/academy. So that'll be officially live on August 8th. And so those are the best ways. And then we're Conscious Intimacy Games on Instagram. We got all sorts of videos and content on there that support a lot of these ideas, particularly around boundaries and the masculine feminine polarity.
Thank you. I've had the privilege and honor of experiencing some of these intimacy games, and they are potent. For those of you listening and desiring to dive deeper, like I have personally gained so much from them, because it gives you this tangible tool, right? I think there's like a lot of this type of work that exists in like the upper chakra, and this just feels incredibly embodied. Like it gives you the opportunity to practice, to do it, to rewire those neural pathways. So I cannot like speak highly enough about Ricky and what he's building. And I'm just so excited that you're launching on the Lionsgate portal. It's perfect.
Yeah, exactly.
Literally a perfect date. Well chosen.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you again so much, Ricky, for joining us. I feel like we traveled to the cosmos and beyond in such a short amount of time, covered so much information, went through all the eras and generations and philosophies and religions, and coming back here, just like finding myself grounding back in the body in this present moment. I'm so grateful for this really amazing talk. And thank you, each and every one of you, for listening and tuning into this episode. We wouldn't be here without you. And we're just so grateful to have you with us on this journey. And if you really enjoyed this episode, enjoyed this conversation, feel like it might benefit people in your life, we would love a like, a follow, and a share with whoever you feel like it could benefit and support, as we're all in this intimate relating in this world. And continue to join us next week as we meet here to continue breaking down the walls of stigma and liberating our truth, one taboo talk at a time. We're SISociety. We're so grateful to have you. And if you want to deepen this conversation, we invite you to join our private WhatsApp group. You can send us a DM on our Instagram at SISociety World, and we can add you into that discussion. Thank you so much.
Yay.